In this video, we're going to learn how to use the gradient map filter in Krita. You can see here that I have two layers. The first layer is a gradient here at the top of the canvas. The left side of the gradient is black while the right side is white. This will be important, so keep that in mind. The second layer is a rainbow photo. The first thing I'll do is select a different foreground color. Then I'll add a new filter layer at the top of the stack. The filter that we want is in the map category. It's called gradient map. This filter maps the color of the image to a gradient that is calculated from these control points called gradient stops. Observe that by default, it uses the currently selected foreground color in one of the gradient stops. There are actually two gradient stops by default, but due to a layout bug, it ends up cropped out inside the window. If we resize the dialog, we'll be able to see the second one. I'll add this filter to the stack and then open its properties dialog to edit the gradient in a smaller window. You can see here that we have this gradient in the dialog that perfectly matches the gradient we had on the canvas. This means that this left gradient stop is replacing the black color that we had here, while the right gradient stop is replacing the white color that we had in the opposite end. We can click and drag to move the gradient stops around. Observe that when we do this, the gradient on the dialog matches the one we had in the canvas perfectly, and the effect on the rest of the image changes accordingly. To create a new gradient stop, simply click on an empty area below the gradient. The new gradient stop will be created with the same color and opacity as the position in the gradient right above where you clicked. To remove a gradient stop, click on the gradient stop and drag it down away from the gradient. After a certain distance, it will disappear. To change the color of a gradient stop, first click on the gradient stop to select it. On this corner, you'll see three buttons to select the color type. The first button lets you use the currently selected foreground color as the color of the gradient stop. This is the red color that we selected before we added the filter. The second button lets you use the background color instead. The third button lets you select a custom color. Then this button and text box to select the color and opacity will appear. If you click on this color button, a dialog appears where you can select a new color. We can change the opacity by dragging or by typing like in any similar text box on Krita. Let's make the other gradient stop fully opaque. This makes the photo in the canvas look really cool, like in Matrix. Nobody would think that this was supposed to be a rainbow because it's all green. Let's add another color. As you may have understood already, the way the gradient map filter works is that it simply maps the color of pixels to a color in the gradient, using nothing more than the brightness of the pixel. This means that low brightness pixels are mapped to the left side of the gradient, while high brightness pixels are mapped to the right side of the gradient. Over here, we have some buttons that we can use to quickly modify the position of the gradient stops. This one flips the gradient. It works kind of like applying a filter to invert the colors before using the gradient map filter. This one sorts the gradient stops by value. Value in this case is a specific way to calculate the brightness of a color, so it essentially means sorting the colors by their brightness. Then we have a button that sorts by hue instead. This is useful if you want to create a rainbow-colored gradient. And finally, we have a button to distribute the gradient stops evenly. Since we have three gradient stops, that means our second gradient stop will be at the middle position. We can also select a gradient stop and specify the position with this text box. If you want to set it to 75% or 25%, for example, you can just type it. Over here we have a button to change the type of gradient to a segment gradient. If we click on it, more control points will appear between the gradient stops. This lets us change the way the colors are interpolated by changing the middle point of each segment of the gradient. If you want simple linear interpolation instead, just click on the button to convert to stop gradient. There is a warning icon next to it because it will cause loss of data. That's because we can't represent this gradient after we edited the middle points using only gradient stops and linear interpolation. So when we click on the button, the gradient will change. The segment mode also has a few other interesting functions. We can select a segment by clicking on it, and then the color and opacity of each end of the segment will both appear in the dialog simultaneously. On the bottom corner, we can choose how colors are interpolated. It does RGB interpolation by default. In this case, that means the middle point will be gray as it transitions from pure red to pure cyan, which is opposite to red. The option under it interpolates hue clockwise, which can be useful in some cases. The final option is hue counterclockwise. The other option we have lets us use an interpolation formula other than linear interpolation. The curved option works the same way as linear when the middle point is at the middle, but it looks different if the middle point is moved first. One way we can use the gradient map filter is to create rainbow gradients from grayscale gradients. That's because Krita has 3 different types of gradients. This one I'm editing is a gradient in a vector layer, which means it's an SVG gradient. The SVG standard doesn't support hue interpolation, so this gradient editor doesn't support it either. I know this sounds a bit weird, but there is another example that might help understand how it works. Krita also supports a thing called SeExpr scripts through fill layers. It's a code that we can paste to generate any pattern that we are able to program. There is a way to specify gradient samplers in such scripts, so Krita has a gradient editor for this too. But this is also a very limited editor. That's because the gradient we edit in the editor just becomes this piece of code in the script. The scripting language doesn't support hue interpolation, so Krita doesn't let you easily create rainbow gradients here. So what we're going to do is just use a simple grayscale gradient for these 2 things, and then we'll use a gradient map filter to map the grayscale values into rainbow colors. To do this, first we're going to click on this button to use the segmented gradient option. Then we click to select the segment, and we'll change the left color to pure red, which has 0 hue, 100% saturation, and 100% value. Then we'll make the other side fully opaque and change its color. The color that we want this time also has 100% saturation and 100% value, but we're going to set the hue to 359 degrees. Since these 2 colors are only 1 degree away from each other, they look exactly the same. But if we change the interpolation to clockwise hue, then it turns them into a rainbow. Next, we'll take a look at the cool features of the Color Mode tab. At first, there isn't much to see here because it's set to blend by default. Let's click on this and change it to nearest. Observe that we don't really have a gradient anymore. We only have 3 distinct colors. Essentially, what this is doing is mapping the nearest color from a given position in the gradient. So for example, here we have the middle between 2 gradient stops. Any position that is closer to the black gradient stop becomes black, and any position that is closer to the green gradient stop becomes green. The same applies to the other side. If the nearest gradient stop is green, the color is green, and if the nearest is purple, the color is purple. This could create a very interesting effect if we had more gradient stops. The next option we have is Dither. If we select this, it looks like the same thing as nearest, except that we have more colors than before. However, that's not actually true. If we zoom in, we can see that we don't actually have more colors. It's the same 3 colors, but they are dithered using a pattern, so when zoomed out, it looks like we have more colors than we actually do. Down here we have a spread setting that lets us increase the contrast of the gradient by making dithered areas smaller. The cool thing about this effect is that it doesn't do just simple dithering like pixel art. We can also use this noise option to create a randomized dithering effect. It's also possible to use a pattern instead. These are the same patterns that we can use elsewhere in Krita. There is all kinds of them, so there's all sorts of ways to dither the gradient. This dialog also lets you choose a gradient from a preset instead of making one from scratch. If you keep using the same gradient across various projects, it may be used to save it as a preset here. This is how you use the gradient map filter in Krita. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you in the next video.